All right, good afternoon, folks. First, I'd like to thank the Navy League and for our panel of distinguished guests for taking their time to come speak with us today on the subject of space. I am Mark Langlois. I'm the Senior Director for Department of Navy at Microsoft. As the Department of Defense looks to leverage artificial intelligence and cloud computing for decision advantage in peacetime and armed conflict, survivable multi-path transport will be critical to ensuring the secure flow of information to warfighters across the globe and in contested areas of operation. With Azure Orbital, Microsoft provides a fully integrated enterprise capability that brings space to our 5G and terrestrial networks, ensuring resilient multi-path transport from the hyperscale cloud to the operational edge. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to our panel's enlightened conversation. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens, and I am the space reporter at Breaking Defense, and I want to thank the Navy League for inviting me here today to moderate this panel, which I hope is going to be interesting and stimulating, as I know it's the after-lunch panel. We have a really diverse set of players here, cast of characters, if you will, for our panel, and I'm not going to go into deep biographies. You can find these in the program, but I am just going to introduce everyone just briefly by their title, and then we will kick off the conversation. We're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves up here, and I hope to leave at least 15 minutes at the end for audience questions, and so be thinking of questions that you can ask. We'd like to see audience participation at these kinds of things. So, first up on my left, we have Vice Admiral Jeffrey Trussler, and he's the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare, N2N6, the Office of Chief of Naval Operations and Director of National Intelligence. Next is Derek Turnier, who's the Executive Director of the Space Development Agency, which just successfully launched their first set of satellites on Sunday. Yay! And next to him is Stephen Bucky Buteau, who is the Director of Space at the Defense Innovation Unit. And last but not least is Ed Zoyce, who is President of Space and Airborne Systems at L3 Technologies. So I'm going to start with you, Vice Admiral, and I'll just ask you to explain in a couple of minutes. You don't have to go through the whole year of your accomplishments, but just explain in a couple of minutes what your office does and how you're connected to the space endeavor.
No, thank you, Teresa. You're assuming we have some accomplishments, all right? Hey, and I'm going to pile on and be the first, second, or third, or whatever today to congratulate Dr. Turnier and the Space Development Agency for their successful launch this weekend. And I expected nothing less than success since you started your young life out as a nuke submariner, kind of like me. So obviously that's got you on the right track. Hey, our office, as Deputy Chief for Information Warfare, this is something I think the Navy really got right several years ago, a little over a decade ago, where the disciplines and stovepipes of how we manage certain aspects of, as rolling into the 21st century, from oceanography to cyber to networks to the systems we depend on and use, and frankly, we were operating until the Space Force stood up in space and intelligence, that we put that together. So that's what I do, and that's why this space panel and the Space Summit we just conducted out at Monterey that the SecNav hosted, I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, all brings this together. And what I'm going to say is that it all comes together in what I call the radio frequency spectrum, and the space topic and all the great work that these folks are doing in space just expand where that spectrum is operating, and the importance of our electromagnetic spectrum operations and warfare expands to that space. Everything they're doing is still connected by what transits that path. And so that's why this is fascinating to me and important to the Navy for our distributed maritime operations.
Thank you. Derek, you want to talk a little bit about what SDA is and does? And once again, congrats on the first set of satellites. Speaking of electromagnetic spectrum, talk about the data.
That's right. Thank you. Yes. 4 years ago in March 2019, the Space Development Agency was established. So we're relatively new. We actually received our funding a year later, so we've actually only had funding for about 3 years. And I want to point out that we were established to be the disruptor to come up with a completely new way to do space architecture. And that's why they brought in a former submariner to do that, because as you saw, when we first sat down here, you all were taking our pictures. What did the disruptor do? He breaks out his camera and he takes a picture back. That's the Navy way, I mean, right, to disrupt things. And so that's what we've been doing at the Space Development Agency. So our mission is speed, delivery, and agility, basically to get capabilities to the warfighter as rapidly as possible. And we're doing that by shifting the architecture to a completely different way of thinking, using two pillars. Number one, proliferation. We're going to stop doing the large satellites. SDA is saying that there's going to be always a room for that, but that's not SDA's view. Our view is we're going to move to hundreds and hundreds of smaller satellites to be able to do those missions, working in conjunction with the larger ones so we get this hybrid architecture. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two, and this is very profound, especially within the Department of Defense, and that is spiral development. And what I mean by that is, by hook or by crook, we will get new capabilities fielded in space every 2 years. That means that we cannot go with what is the most exquisite capability. We are going to go with what we can deliver in 2 years based on what is commoditized technology, what industry can deliver, and that's what we're going to push forward. We will put schedule above cost, and we'll put cost above performance to make sure we hit those 2-year timelines. We're not going to get every capability up in the next 2 years, but we will get more and more capabilities as we continue to fill this out, which means the warfighter will get the capability they need sooner. So that's what we're all about. That's what we're pushing for. Now, what have we done? So, like I mentioned, 3 years ago we got our first funding. Since then, we've flown 6 demonstration experiments. But the big news was just on Palm Sunday yesterday, we actually launched 10 satellites in our Tranche 0. Our spirals are called tranches. And so 0 is our warfighter immersion tranche. We have another launch coming up in June, so we'll have a total of 28 satellites in Tranche 0 to demonstrate low latency connectivity for laser communication in space, for Link 16, which has always been a terrestrial communication layer, directly to space, so that the warfighters, the sailors, the airmen, the Marines, and the soldiers can actually communicate directly with the satellites. Why is that important? Because historically, they've used their tactical radios to conduct operations, and they've been limited to a range of a few hundred nautical miles. Well, that's fine if you're conducting limited operations, but if you're going to start to prosecute hundreds and hundreds of targets rapidly, you're going to have to pull in targeteers from all over the globe. Being able to tie into a space transport layer allows you to do that. So you can have people targeting distributed across the globe, very resilient fashion, and send those targeting solutions directly back into theater. That's number one. Number two, we're going to field a constellation that does advanced missile tracking. So you've heard a lot about these advanced hypersonic glide vehicles, hypersonic weapons. We'll actually be able to track them so that we can send firing solutions directly down so that you can release SWEPs based on what we are tracking so that you can intercept and take out those threats. So that's what we're all about. We're going to get those capabilities. We're going to finish out this year with our Tranche 0 so that the warfighter can start to exercise and prove that out. Then Tranche 1, which begins launching in just 18 months, will actually be the first initial warfighting capability. So at that point, so now we're talking in 2025, we'll be able to have the ability to take the fight to a regional theater and bring these technologies to bear. So Semper Citius, thank you. I'm looking forward to the panel.
Thanks, Derek. Bucky, tell us about DIU and what you do.
Sure. The Defense Innovation Unit, 3 purposes, which actually complement what Derek and the Space Development Agency do very well. Number 1, accelerate the adoption of commercial technology in the Department of Defense. 2 is to disrupt, transform military capabilities by using more integration of those commercial capabilities. And 3rd is to build and grow the National Security Innovation Base. So the exciting thing is I'm the prototype validator guy. He's the acquirer. And what SDA is doing is they're codifying a $2 billion, what's the market cap you think for the commercial integration things, just with the future of your proliferated architecture?
Yes, so every tranche and every layer is right about $2 billion a year.
Right. So if you're a commercial company in the room and you haven't done anything with us, you should contact both organizations. So contact me, because we'll tell you how to put the rubber to the pavement and get going. But here's a key thing. We want to see commercially viable companies. In other words, you have a business outside of just defense, because we're not hiring just defense contractors. We have plenty of those. But they do commercial stuff too. So it's really important that we have that dual use application. And we'll work with you. And actually, we've got some technology that's already being used by Space Development Agency. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bucky. Ed, you want to wrap up here and let us know what you do over at Space and Airborne Systems?
Absolutely. First of all, welcome everybody, and let me add my congratulations to you, Derek. You are changing the game in Space Development Agency, and we're proud to be part of your tracking solution as well. So we look forward to launches here in the near future to get that constellation up and running. Look, L3 Harris has had a very long history in space, well over 50 years. Perhaps one of the things, or two of the things that you may know L3 Harris for is the GPS signals that you receive each and every day. We provide the heart of the GPS constellation and have since the beginning of GPS. We also provide those weather products that you look at every night on the TV or on your phone to see if it's going to rain or snow. So all the advanced imagers that NOAA currently flies today are L3 Harris imagers, just to name a few. Look, we're really excited to be part of the forum today and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Since this is a space panel, we're going to start with a kind of a God's eye view of the situation and work our way down to some more specifics. So off the top, I want to start with you, Vice Admiral. Looking at the threat environment, which we've heard a lot about over the last 2 years, how the threat environment is changing and the threats are multiplying. What's your biggest concern with regard to space right now, with the ability of U.S. forces to maintain assured access to space in particular? What keeps you up at night?
Oh, hey, great question, and thank you. So I briefly mentioned it. Really, the space layer, as now we are proliferating, both the government and industry providing just some tremendous solutions. It is really an expansion of that RF spectrum and how we're going to use it. The Navy, we're at sea. We don't have Cat 5 cable connecting us to anything. We're dependent on that spectrum to do our distributed maritime operations. So we're looking at how best to utilize and take advantage of all that capability. Because in the end, everything we do depends on some form, when we're talking about space capability, some form of an antenna and some form of a processor and receiver. And what you have on top of your house or in your backyard is not good enough for a ship at sea under the conditions it deals with. So what we're thinking about and looking is how are we going to take advantage of that? And this isn't just for the ability for us to access the internet. It's to pass some complex formats and waveforms over, and how are we going to take advantage of both our government and commercial. Now, you said the threats. You said the word threat. And, you know, the part that keeps me up at night, how we're going to use this. But the adversary, that big adversary, okay, in East Asia, we call them the People's Republic of China. They've made their intentions for the capability they want to have and how they might use it very clear. Their president has said it. That's not intelligence, that's open source. The behavior and actions that they are demonstrating every day do not indicate that they are doing anything other than just pursuing those capabilities and potentially reunification of Taiwan by force. You saw that in the 60 Minutes episode where the Admiral Paparo so eloquently described, what might happen. So, some intentions stated, capabilities they're working towards, but you know what? That's gotten the attention of the United States of America, and especially the Department of Defense. So, nothing can be worse for an adversary to get our attention. I have never seen the department more focused on an adversary and the things we need to do. And despite what you sometimes hear in the paper or what we're arguing about or what you might hear questions about how things are covered on Capitol Hill, we are uber focused on that. And the work that we're doing in space, once you turn the United States of America on to an industry, a capability domain, we're going to move out and move out fast, and we're doing that.
Thank you. Derek, you want to talk a little bit about SDA's, about the resiliency issue, since that is, as we all know, a direct, well, as we know, maybe perhaps not everyone out here knows, is kind of a direct response to the threat environment.
Sure. So You know, if you really think about resiliency in space, there's a couple aspects of that. The primary aspect that we're looking at from SDA's model is we want to make sure that we can provide those ships at sea the connectivity they need. And so if you start pulling the thread on that and say that's your minimum viable product, so what are the threat vectors? Well, so you can shoot down the satellites so they can't talk to the ships. Okay. Well, so now we'll put up hundreds and hundreds of satellites. Now it's actually our satellites are more affordable than the missiles that you'd need to shoot them down. So we've kind of taken that off the table. We've made it to where, okay, it's really difficult to shoot those satellites down just by virtue of proliferation. So we kind of got that. Well, then you start to say, well, what about if you just try to go after certain layers, you try to take out everything in LEO? Well, that's why the Space Force is moving to this hybrid architecture, and that's what Bucky talks a lot about that. And so that is, you'll reside in multiple orbits. So you get resiliency not only from hundreds and hundreds of satellites, but hundreds of satellites that are working in conjunction with dozens that are in different orbits. So now it's really difficult to actually take out the space layer. So then, from SDA's perspective, I'm really concerned about these common mode failures. And the two common mode failures that I'm worried about, number one is cyber. So you got to make sure you don't have cyber vulnerabilities, because if there's a common mode failure that can take out all your satellites or your ground systems, then you can't proliferate your way out of that. So that's a major concern. We have a lot of protections in place, and that's something that we put a lot of resources on to make sure that we're hardened against cyber threats. The second one is supply chain interdiction. Now that could be that could take on two different models. Number one is just pure benign supply chain difficulties, right? And Ed can talk a lot about this, working on our programs where we're trying to build a lot of satellites quickly just to have the robustness in industry to be able to supply those components. That's kind of a benign supply chain threat. The other supply chain threat, though, is not benign, and that is if there are people that are putting in counterfeit parts or nefarious parts into your supply chain, you need to be able to detect those and protect yourself against those. So we actually look at a lot of different methods of doing non-destructive testing to assure that that doesn't happen. And then finally, obviously, the RF spectrum itself is contested. The RF spectrum, you can jam it, you can try to spoof different aspects of it. It's not a peaceful domain. And RF spectrum combat is something you're going to hear a lot more about. You know, I think the Navy's kind of leading the way in that because, as Admiral Tressler mentioned, that vulnerable to that is their lifeblood, is the RF spectrum. And so from that aspect, we're continuing to work with different groups who are pushing the limit on different waveforms to be able to have anti-jet type systems and those kind of things to be able to fight through those environments. But that's what we look, and that's what we talk about when we talk about resiliency.
Thank you. Hybrid architecture, that leads to you, Bucky, but also there's the question of part of the hybrid architecture is commercial. And part of the work that you do is centered on bringing new commercial players in. So you want to talk about how commercial can respond to the threat, and maybe also at the same time, what are the challenges to bringing commercial players, and I guess allied players too, on board into this hybrid architecture? Because it's kind of, there are both obstacles and opportunities, I guess, there.
Sure. Well, a little different perspective on the threat. So a lot of the threats we face in industry are internal. So our economic security and national security are really intertwined, and getting more so if you look at the things like SDA and the Navy are doing. So things that we're working on very diligently across all of government. One is the financial stability. So that in our market, we can't have niche parts of the financial sector that are absolutely critical, driving a whole part of our economy. So normalizing the technology sector into the rest of our very diverse and resilient financial structures would be the first thing. Second, which Derek brought up, is supply chain. It's amazing from our perspective, and we work with our partners, big and small, just how constrained we are. And a lot of that is because we've outsourced so many different things that we need. You know, microelectronics is just one area, but I mean, try to find. I'm very concerned. One of the things I'm trying to take on this year is trusted supply chains for like solar cells. I mean, we 20 years ago, we were like, you couldn't hold a match to the United States for solar technology. Today, we're like bottom of the bucket. And this is at a time when we're starting to go transition to proliferated architecture. So it's very important that we do that supply chain resiliency, and really I think the third thing, which is really important, is on the policy side. Anytime you do anything disruptive with technology, you have to actually kind of lead it with policy. They work hand in hand. So whether it's the 5G and how we're going to use it in non-terrestrial networks, or even just trying to free up spectrum or protect spectrum, there's policy is big on that. So we have to actually make sure that policymakers are tracking and working very tightly together with us to make sure everything's done. I think we're going to come back to hybrid architecture, so I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Thanks. Ed, for the national security space leadership to respond to the threats, they first have to begin with a clear understanding of the space environment, space situational awareness. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that and how you get the data from space situational awareness to the people who have to make the decisions about responding to the threat? Because that's a threat in and of itself. If you can't get the data down to the people who need it, it's a problem. Nobody can work.
Yeah, look, that's a multi-layered question. There's a lot of places we could go with that. Just a couple places would be around just what's happening in space. Is there a rocket booster that's moving? What does the space domain awareness piece tell us? And then how do we get that quickly, not only to our military leaders, but also to our commercial operators who have to maybe move out of the way of a piece of debris that they can't quite see? Another area that I think is critically important is really around, as we think about China, there's capabilities now on the space axis that can only be performed in space. For example, GMTI and AMTI, traditional air operations now moving up to space and taking those kill chains right down to the warfighter, talking about getting the right data to the right place, at the right time. They need direct downlinks. You talked a little bit about that, Derek, with, the tracking layer, taking that targeting data right down to the warfighter. We're going to need to do that with GMTI and AMTI. It can't be processed back to a center and then from the center disseminated back out. And so as we think about how to keep resiliency, moving data around, all of those are the factors that we as an industry and government are working on together.
What are the challenges you see, Ed, to commercial being, I guess, more of a player in hybrid architectures? We've been, just to be frank, we've been talking about DoD's been talking about getting more commercial companies, getting commercial as a service, relying more on commercial capabilities for a number of years. Until recently, we haven't seen that move very far or very fast. So can you maybe talk about what the obstacles are to that?
Sure. Clearly, there's when you talk commercial, it's around business case. And so I think the first business case that always closes commercially is communications, which is why you see the proliferated LEO architectures now in communications. When you think about having a service for the government, whether it be radar imagery or geospatial imagery, some close, some don't close. Some require government subsidies, some require a government main tenant. Those business models, I would say, are still playing themselves out. Clearly, on a geospatial basis, we've seen what the commercial providers have been able to do with Ukraine, downlinking commercial data, instantly to our NATO partners. I think there are other parts of the DoD mission that are probably uniquely DoD and never get commercialized.
I'm bouncing around a little bit here, but when we talk about integrating commercial, one of the issues that tends to come up is the issue of classification. And that's also an issue for allies. Bucky, can you talk a little bit about that? This is another issue that seems to be talked about all the time, the problem of overclassification, and yet you don't see a lot of things actually changing.
We both had the great opportunity to work with Mike Griffin, and one of his stories he tells is about how we kind of lost our edge on hypersonics, where in China there's more than a dozen universities that do applied hypersonics, and in the U.S. we don't. And it's a great case for when you overclassification and compartmentalizing things to where you stifle innovation. So I think it's really important that what we do is we have to do we have to make it interesting for academia. We have to make it interesting in the commercial sector. But we definitely have to protect the things that we need to protect. We need to be able to share capabilities and access to those capabilities with our allies and partners. I've been a warfighter for a quarter of a century, and I never went anywhere that we went by ourselves, right? And it gets very contentious, because if we have a capability that we can't use, we probably leave it on the shelf, frankly, because we have to be able to interoperate. So I think there's a lot of efforts being done. I think space being born in a strategic realm is it has some growing pains with that. But the best thing to do is just pour rocket fuel on the things like what Derek's doing, because he's adopting the commercial capabilities and he's able to integrate fast. Agility, I actually think agility, you can make a stronger argument for not just cyber, but in terms of our national security, that moving fast is more effective than just locking down information for long periods of time.
Ed, just for your take on this, do you think that the issues are the issues in the technological realm, that you can't share the information without giving away secrets, or is it more policy?
I think it's policy. I think clearly customers want to maintain their own SAPs. From an industry perspective, it's interesting. Oftentimes, we're exposed to multiple customers, special access programs. And unfortunately, we're doing work for a customer that another customer is asking us to develop. And so industry ends up being the matchmaker, where we're asking customer A if they could please brief customer B into the work that we're doing, because we're already finished with it, right? And so that happens, day in and day out. I hate to say that, but that's the reality of the situation.
It's funny because it happens the other way too, and it is ridiculous, right? I've seen it on both sides. It happens when you in the government, you see part of company A is doing something that the other part of company A doesn't know about, and so the government serves as matchmaker to industry, and industry serves as matchmaker within the government, and it is because this whole model of overclassification. I'll even have that as I'll go back to classification when we talk about speed of acquisition, because I think that overclassification was driven by the fact that the acquisition system is broken. So it makes it easier to acquire when it's heavily classified.
By the way, we deal mostly with proprietary information, and I tell you, it's like we have to sign a non-disclosure agreement inside the government because of the type of proprietary information that we have access to, and that is like, how many people knew about Chat GPT, before it just came out in the Christmas time? So the industry knows how to lock down information, but they also know the benefits of releasing it and commoditizing it, and I think that it may be that the overclassification thing, and then of course the acquisition really relates to fielding, because if it's above a collateral secret level, most likely me as a warfighter, I'm not gonna touch it.
Yeah, a very complex topic, because I get asked about overclassification all the time, and in a very general sense. I don't think really the problem is overclassification. It's our ability and our procedures for allowing access to that. I'll quote General Barrier, director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, when we're just talking even simple things. He quotes in front of Congress that dealing with China, the largest theft of intellectual property in human history. They're going after everything. And even our simple acquisition processes provide them more information about what we're doing, trying to do, the gaps and problems. I assume that there are foreign intelligence service agents here at this conference. We track them. I get reports from NCIS. They're here monitoring even this unclassified forum. So I don't look at overclassification like that. It's when we're trying to work together what we limit each other from doing. And I, before AFCEA West, before this conference, I sent out some stern notes to all the Navy participants that said, watch what you say, watch what you do. Here's things and settings and so forth for your phone. but make sure the adversary doesn't get an advantage because we continue to articulate some problem that we're having or some challenge or some grievance we have. Eventually they might start believing that, wow, this must be an area that they really have a challenge in, and they start pulling that string. Or they're finding accesses to people, places, things, and information they don't have now because of the weak security you may just have on your phone right now, scanning QR codes and things. Sorry for all you people that have QR codes out there. But a lot of challenges. So it's about how we share information and doing that right. Back to what Dr. Tournier said, the cyber threat and the inroads to our information, that's a challenge, not just as simple as overclassification.
So it's a complex issue.
Yes, ma'am.
And now we know why he was taking a picture of y'all.
Well, speaking of sharing information and kind of connectivity, the National Defense Strategy, the 2022 National Defense Strategy, centers on what's called now integrated deterrence. And senior Space Force officials pretty much have asserted that space is central to that, is central to the concept. It's a foundation of the concept, if you will. And this is especially with regard to communications networks, right? So I'm kind of interested to see what your thoughts are and what the challenges are to achieving the space capabilities you need to have integrated deterrence, because it goes back to how you share information, it goes back to kind of all the threads that we've been starting to pull on in this conversation. I want to start with you.
Hey, absolutely. So first of all, I would say that this idea and the implementation to stand up the Space Force was a great idea. Because what the DoD was using before was each service had pieces of the pie and supply. Now we have a service focused on a specific domain and capabilities. Now, our challenge, the challenge for the Joint Force is to make sure we articulate well those capabilities we need to the Space Force and to the National Reconnaissance Office, how they can best support us. Getting those Joint Force requirements right. And, you know, even it was mentioned earlier, the most viable commercial is satellite communications. In the DoD, that becomes the least sexy thing to talk about because we want to get after ISR, GMTI, and all these other great capabilities. We need to make sure we can communicate in that environment that is going to be extraordinarily challenged because we're going to be, the adversary and us are going to be poking each other hard trying to lock that environment down and prevent those communications. So the stand-up of the Space Force, I think, is a step forward. Now it's the Joint Force process that we must align to make sure that we produce those requirements that they need to provide for us.
Anyone else want to jump on that?
You know, I would add, look, as we think of integrated deterrence, you know, what we want to do is have the enemy wake up every day and them think today is not the day, right? That industry is delivering what we need to fill the capability gaps that we have for our nation, and that, you know, as we look at what we disclose to our adversaries, I'm sure there's a very delicate balance, Admiral, you and your peers do on what systems and capabilities you want them to know we have versus what systems and capabilities they don't know that will be unwarned. So all of those things, I think, in the end, you know, bake into the discussion of how we deter an enemy from taking action.
If your strategy is contingent, if your strategy is contingent on anti-access and aerial denial, the underlying assumption is that you have superiority in key domains, right? So for the first half of my career, you know, when I'm an Air Force guy, so we come in and they go, hey, unless we're dropping nukes, your job is you're either supporting the Navy in the maritime environment or you're supporting the Army in the land environment. Got it. And then the second half of my career is like, oh, space. You know, it's like we have to have space superiority because GPS and all comms, a lot of interesting things we do, and great capabilities that we can't talk about, which is great. But now, and Ukraine demonstrated that you have to have information superiority, right? So the key thing is we have to have a lot of superiority in this multi-domain environment at global scale, because that's how we project power with the Navy globally every day, right? And so you start to see why this is so important. But we don't want to like spend all of our lunch money on just maintaining that, right? So the wonderful thing is when we do things like we proliferate LEO with a commercial constellation that can make money, or we have reusable rockets, or we can collect imagery around the planet every day with something the size of a toaster. That's also a means of demonstrating superiority, right? Technological superiority, and in a way that we can actually monetize that, and it strengthens the economy, so we can pay for the things we can't monetize. So I think it's a bigger thing. We can't just say, well, this is the only priority. We have to balance our portfolio and bring it all together in a way that does exactly what you mentioned, which is that our adversaries look at America and say, no, today's not the day.
So I'll just say one thing about deterrence, right? So you can't, and maybe my shipmate and I'll disagree on some of the classification, over-classification or not, but you can't deter if you can't talk about it. So 30 years ago, it makes me feel old thinking 30 years ago, but 30 years ago, you couldn't say National Reconnaissance Office, right? There was no such office. As soon as we declassified that fact and said there was an NRO, did you think the Soviets said, wow, the Americans have spy satellites? No, I mean, I think that they probably knew ahead of time. But so that's kind of the point, is that we have to make sure that we're not classifying things that don't have real critical protected information that we need to protect. For example, at SDA, I think we're on the forefront of that deterrence, because we're out there saying, this is the capability we're going to provide, and we're going to provide this every 2 years, and this is what our warfighters are going to be able to do with it. So know that if you try to do something, it's going to be a bad day for you. And so I think you need to balance that. You know, there's side, and look, I've worked on the intel side, so I've been on the complete opposite, where you classified what you were eating for lunch. And then, to the Department of Defense, which is more, we fight wars at secret, so everything's got to be secret so that we can share with our allies, and we can get it to the warfighter and fight. So there's a balance there, and we have to make sure that we know what we need to protect. Obviously, you need to protect any vulnerabilities or specific capabilities, but we also need to be able to talk about what we're doing so that people understand, and there is a deterrence factor.
I always giggle because I always tell a story of once an NRO person trying to tell me that that he didn't care that I could see the certain spy satellite with my $88 telescope from Target, that it still should remain classified. We had a very large argument about that back in the day. Sometimes it seems that we are our own worst enemies, on some of these issues, and so I want to ask about a couple of those things, and one of them is about LEO, and I think we are all talking about proliferated architectures, and primarily in LEO, but now we're starting to see people moving into MEO as well, and LEO is already congested, as the Space Force would say, and contested, but congested is a big thing. And we're looking at hundreds and hundreds of thousands of satellites in LEO if you start looking overseas at what China wants to do in LEO, what the EU wants to do in LEO, what we DoD are doing in LEO, what the commercial sector wants to do in LEO. How concerned are you about more debris, more signal interference, more potential collisions, and how that might affect DoD's ability to operate in that regime? I'm going to start with you, Derek, because that's your baby. LEO's your baby.
Is Darren McKnight in the audience? Because I'm going to say so. There's a couple. There's two schools of thought on LEO. One is obviously space is congested. We're one collision away from a Kessler syndrome, and the sky is falling. Then there's the other end of the spectrum, and that is space is big. The truth lies somewhere in between, and really it lies in very specific areas. So very specific orbital regimes are congested. And then others, space is very big. And so you have to be careful about lumping all LEO into one. And so especially when you start to look at creating rules and policies to try to mitigate it, because there's unintended consequences. For example, the rule that we've been operating under the policy, 25 years at the end of life, you deorbit. What that means is physics tells you that if you're 600 kilometers and below, you don't really need to worry about deorbit. Physics will take care of it. And so that's what most of the commercial constellations have tried to operate in that realm, which means that 600 kilometers and below, which in particular, you know, is where the space station lives, they start to get very congested because it's very affordable, very cheap to populate that area because you don't have to worry about deorbit because physics will take care of it. We at SDA, we operate above that. We operate in about 1,000 kilometers. So that means we have to think about end of life and how to do positive deorbit so that we can maintain that 25-year rule. Now the rule is changing from 25 years to 5 years, so that will kind of take that 600 kilometer off the table. People will start to have to revisit. Now I think more and more people will have to think about positive deorbit at end of life, which is a good thing. So I actually think the problem will fix itself. I think the policies in place, you know, if they take a slight hand, I don't think we need a hard hand. So some people, some of our European allies are looking at kind of a 6-month end of life deorbit. That's maybe a little too draconian, but the model that you have to be a good steward and you have to be able to get out of your orbital slot and deorbit, I think is a good one. And in fact, it's made me change my mind on some of the business cases for some of the commercial models. Just a few years ago, I was of the belief that these commercial orbit servicing models didn't really have a business case because there really wasn't much to that. But now, I think it makes a lot of sense because I can take more risk on my satellite. I can design my satellite to maybe have single string on propulsion, which is bad, meaning that if I lose my propulsion, then I'm stuck up there on space junk. But I don't worry about it because if there's a commercial company that I can then pay a few $1 million to take that satellite and deorbit it, that's worth it to me. So that's where the commercial model, I think, takes off, is now I can take more risk and make my satellites more affordable because I know there's a trash man that can help me clean up.
Anyone else want to jump on that?
Yeah, and I think the insurance markets are going to have something to say about this too, right? Because that's only about today. It turns out only about half of the commercial companies are carrying insurance. But as the market matures and they want to get more finance and do things with the government, they're going to have to do things to normalize with the rest of the economy. But I agree with Derek, and I also say with this, you know, there's as many operating satellites as there are in LEO. There's just as many operating airplanes in a much smaller volume of airspace over the United States right now. So but we have an airspace traffic management thing that the whole world has adopted and complies with. So as we get better with traffic management, more satellites are going to have the ability to maneuver, you know, at some scale. And if you can't maneuver, then the maneuverable. There's rules for all this in aviation. I think it's really important that the space traffic management side really gets formalized and adopted in an ICO type of global scale. And that's going to be really good. And that's going to actually save lives and prevent a lot of problems. Most of the debris that to really worry about is you know, either 1 to 3 centimeters or sub-centimeter and scale. And those are, we're just going to have to wait for the physics on that. And then and you know, get away from expendable you know, stages and things like that if we can. Reusable launch is going to make a big difference there.
Okay, I'm going to circle back to something that was talked about right in the beginning, and that was the access to the spectrum. Because once again, speaking of being our own worst enemies on occasion, we've had internal administration, not just this administration, internal government debates about the question of who gets to access what spectrum. Spectrum is a limited resource. It is not infinite. And right now, the big issue is 5G, and either the promise of 5G and how we can exploit 5G and it'll make our communications all great and better and everything, but also the fact that 5G terrestrial networks require spectrum and those operators are trying or looking to take spectrum from satellite communications in order to use for the terrestrial networks. And so I want to turn to you, as I know spectrum is something, 5G and all that's been on your mind. So Let's talk a little bit about that problem, opportunity, problem, opportunity, problem.
All the above. And I usually tell folks if invited to a panel or to speak or whatever, I'm not going to come unless I get a question on spectrum. Because, hey, it is a challenge. It is a superpower challenge that we have because industry has so many innovative ideas where they want to improve the quality of service, quality of life, and bring us more ideas to solve problems. Their demand for more chunks of the spectrum, and a lot of that is allocated to the federal, to the DoD. I get it. What a great problem to have. Now, some of the challenges we have is that spectrum place where it was allocated to DoD, that's where we've spent decades and billions of dollars providing systems for ballistic missile defense, air traffic control, the heart of the Navy's weapons systems at sea and the Aegis system, et cetera, et cetera. And you've heard, if you watch congressional testimony this round, Northcom commander, Stratcom commander, multiple have quoted and concerned. So this is something that Congress is dealing with because industry is making extraordinary business cases to free up more of the RF spectrum for their use to help us, to make our life better. On the other hand, we have a lot of systems already in place that we're not going to be able to flip a switch overnight and turn. My biggest concern and what I hope for, that I'm not seeing a lot of, is that those advocates on the side for sharing more or asking us to vacate, and those who say it would be a real national security problem with respect to our training and readiness and missile defense capabilities, I don't see them having the same hearings or in the same room with both sides laid out. I think each side is describing the other side's problem, and I'm probably accused of that too. But this is a challenge because that spectrum space, and of course we're talking about the sweet spots of that mid-band down there in the S-band.
3.1 to 3.45, right?
That is some legislation I have seen passed, and I don't try to get into specifics of what is really concerning or not, but that has been written in some draft legislation. So we're trying to make our case and make sure we're heard and that the implications are understood, and that actually asking and recommending that no action be taken until the study that the DoD was required to do by the NDAA of 21 be done so that we can talk about those impacts and have it laid out for everybody to look at.
Do you know when that study is supposed to be done?
It's late summer, run by OSD and the DoD CIO, but right now it's advertised as late summer.
Just one more sub-question on that. I know that Navy's Aegis capabilities fall in some of this mid-band, S-band contested spectrum. And have you guys done any kind of assessment of like what the costs would be or the time would be for you to have to, if you had to vacate that and use something else?
Decades and billions.
Anybody else want to jump in on the spectrum question?
I think some of the spectrum issues, not all of them, but some of the spectrum issues we have are self-created because when we go back 40 years ago, 50 years ago when the GeoSatcoms came about, they were just basically given chunks of spectrum, and you just have to say, well, are we optimizing that spectrum? So coming back to the hybrid space architecture, part of the vision there is how can we get better utility of spectrum? So some of those spectrum issues may be localized, and then can we route information across different parts of the architecture? Because really, at the end of the day, if I'm in the cockpit or you're in a battleship at sea or sub, you want your packet of information, and you want it in a very low latency state. So having an architecture similar to the internet that can actually allow us to move information and maybe do other things. Part of that architecture could be an avenue to commoditizing spectrum, so companies that control parts of spectrum can make it available to others who need it on a temporary basis and then get it back. So we're looking at this whole thing from a business model standpoint that says what's sustainable and how do we do this in a way that's scalable beyond LEO.
Thank you. So I ran over a little bit in our discussion up here because it's just so interesting, and I keep wanting to ask my own questions. But I'm going to turn to the audience now. I see we have someone standing there. If you could please state your name and where you're from, and keep your question short.
Sure, thanks.
And to the point.
Matt
Thanks.
Clindergucci, great event. Really appreciate the insights. Glad to see Derek Stillwell in his cowboy boots. Nicely done. Quick thought, maybe it's philosophical, and I promise, Vice Admiral Trask, I appreciate the sensitivity and the requirements of this room. Any future fight or conflict, we all know the naval forces are going to be a big part of that. We just know it. And I guess my question is, again, in the confines of this room, and being careful, can you give us some insights, and it could be for anyone, Derek, SDA perspective, JT, N2, N6, Ed, Industry, Steve, DUI. How are we ensuring that the maritime mission sets, we don't own the satellites anymore, right? That's Space Force and it's SDA's, that's your place. How are we ensuring that our mission sets are going to be protected or at least certainly satisfied for our warfighting missions? And you could share any way you could for us that might be able to help, or just, concerned about our naval forces, if that makes sense.
Hey, what a great question. And that's one of the reasons that last week we had Secretary of the Navy's Space Summit out at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. You may have seen an article hit the street about that last night. Several days of discussion at the classified level, TS, SCI, SAP level, where we had members of Space Com, Space Force, the operators from Pacific Fleet, Admiral Paparo and his team were there, and then from the folks that do requirements and resourcing and policy back here in the Pentagon. And so that's step one. It's about that dialogue. Over the past year, the Navy and the Space Force have had multiple staff talks together at all classification levels, and we're working, the Navy is working, leading the way to make sure we get after and clearly define those joint force requirements so that new service can satisfy us all. And we're a maneuverable, you got it right, the maritime domain, that's the maneuverable striking force out there, and we're going to have, some of our operations are going to depend heavily on space for our weapon system, for GPS, for our communications, and how we're going to maneuver and stay alive. So a big concern of ours, but that's why we are being proactive. We're inviting them. We're initiating those staff talks to make sure there is no question or debate when we evaluate each other's budgets and when we're talking with each other.
Yeah, from the SDA perspective, we have our Warfighter Council. We don't come up with our requirements. Warfighter Council, we get those requirements from the combatant commanders and the other services. The Navy's a big player in that, and that's what we use to make sure that we can sign up to say this is what we'll provide you, and that's kind of the stick that they have in the Warfighter Council. And obviously, then if we're not successful, then we get keelhauled.
Next in line, please.
Thank you, that was encouraging, thank you.
Afternoon, Allison Cuervo, retired Intel analyst, now at Data Miner. My question is about PII and comes in two parts. What would you say the role PII has in information advantage in the space AOR, and how would information consumers prefer to receive that kind of information that might differ than traditional consumption?
I'll tell you one of the things we're working on at DIU with industry, and we're working very diligently to make sure that the information that you have access to is trusted, not just in a secure environment, but in our public domain. We need to do a better job of providing trusted parts of the architecture, trusted means, so that when you get Teresa's next article in Breaking Defense, it's actually written by her, it reflects her thoughts, it hasn't been manipulated in any way. And there's really good ways to do that, and we just have to apply it. But this is, I'll come back to something again, which is speed and agility. We can't stop in our tracks and be happy with the current state of affairs with our technology. The world is banging at our door, and they want to surpass us technologically. So having programs, not just in a space development agency, but it'd be wonderful to see programs of record at the Navy adopt the same model and say, you know what, this is how we're going to do procurement in the future. Then you're actually disrupting the entire department, not just when part of the space agency.
Okay, next.
Hi, my name is Catherine Carter. I'm from Tritus, and we do encryption of data at all levels of classification with CSFC commercial devices. And so my question is what role does data encryption on commercial devices play in your defensive strategy and needs, especially with this push to do more computational processes as close to the tactical edge, such as satellites and so forth, to ensure the data is protected both at rest and in transit?
I'll take that one. So that's a big deal, right? So for our transport layer, we are essentially, if you say that the internet in space is the outer net, we say our transport layer is the SOPR net, so it's the SIPR net, the secret layer in space. And so it's a big deal. We encrypt. Basically, we use software, HAPI-based encryption across our platforms because the satellites are smaller and we're moving a lot of data. So it's to get the authority to connect commercial systems on board. That's one of the issues that we're trying to work out and solve. And we have a couple different ways. One way is to have these so-called translator sats that act as trusted VPNs, as nodes between our SOPR net and the commercial entities. Other ways would be just to doubly encrypt and use bent pipes, which is the easiest, but it's not as useful because then you have to get it down to the ground somewhere before you can actually process it and use it. But I mean, I don't have the solution to that. It is a big deal, and it's something that we're concerned with and are looking at very seriously.
The hybrid space architecture that we're working on, the internet, if you will, in space, it's going to be, we're seeing it as a zero trust architecture. However, it's got some really great capabilities built into it. For data provenance, we're using a blockchain methodology to make sure that we're tracking every transaction. We have a variable trust model, so depending if you're moving your banking information, you can actually reduce the architecture to a very high level of trust. But if you're just checking the sports scores and you don't want that, you can actually go with a lower level of trust, right? So that we're trying to, it's kind of like a quality of service model. But the wonderful thing is that all the companies that we're working with, big and small, are bringing really fantastic technologies forward. I'll just give one example. Homomorphic encryption. So you can actually do an analysis on classified data sets without declassifying information. It's so amazing to see these things, and they're actually, these things are very mature in different parts of the economy. And so you need programs like we're talking about to be able to bring these nuggets together. And then, again, my job is to prototype them, validate them, and then serve them up on a platter with hopefully a nice diversified set so there's no vendor lock, so then organizations like SDA can say, I want that, we're going to fly it in tranche N. So that's kind of how the future is going on that.
Okay, one last question.
Hi, I'm Kate Macri with GovCIO Media. My question is primarily a workforce one. So the American Association of Geodetic Surveying published a white paper last year saying that DoD and the defense community in general is running very low on geodesy professionals with GPS expertise, which is pretty important to what you guys are talking about today, and that China will permanently eclipse the US in terms of people with GPS training and expertise if that doesn't change. So I'm wondering from your perspective, and I guess this is a question primarily for Vice Admiral Trussler, like how is the GPS workforce playing into your considerations and concerns here?
Hey, thank you for that question. A funny term, the GPS workforce. I spend a measurable amount of my time talking about GPS. Its security, alternate solutions for positioning and timing outside of using the GPS constellation. If we go back to that discussion we keep talking about or implying, that will be part of a conflict should we go to it. We will probably both be targeting each other's satellite-based positioning, navigation, and timing solutions. So I spent an extraordinary amount of time on that. What I'm heartened by is the number of professionals that we have in our acquisition community that are working that, the number of professionals from a Navy standpoint in our meteorological and oceanographic community, the folks that this is their job and their expertise looking at this. If you know, as you understand, the Navy is, we sort of keep time for the nation, specifically for the DoD, time, and are those, and that key component of the position experts. So I don't know that I see a deficit in the workforce that we're working with for the missions and jobs we provide right now. I do see, by the capabilities we're going to produce, potentially, that there will be need to be a greater understanding of beyond what our luxury life is right now, whether cars are at sea, how we're going to operate without GPS. So I wouldn't call it necessarily our workforce issue, but our operators at sea and in the air, the different solutions that we're going to have to provide, and the comfort level and familiarity of our operaters to use them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everyone. We are dead out of time, right down to the wire here. So I appreciate everyone coming, and thanks to our, please give a big round of applause to our wonderful panel up here. Thank you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.